There are plenty of times when a static camera shot is all you need. There are even times when having your camera stay completely still is actually the most effective way to communicate your point or tell your story. But sometimes, a subtle camera movement can bring your shot to life, direct the audience's focus, or just add some visual interest to your video. And if you're like me, filming alone most of the time, it can be tough to add in camera movements. Sure, you could use something like a motorized slider, but that's not always practical or available, and that's when keyframes come into play. And speaking of sliders, let's look at the opening shot for my motorized slider review, which I'm actually really proud of. I wanted to show the camera moving on the slider, but I didn't realize until editing how much better it would look if the camera were moving and following the other camera on the slider. So I added a few keyframes to track the camera, and it totally brought this shot to life. Now instead of just one static shot, the camera kind of pushes in at the beginning and then follows the movement of my camera as it moves up the slider. It's very subtle, but it added a really dynamic layer to the opening of that video. Excuse me while I drink my favorite beverage with very little flavor, Subtlety, because subtlety is key when it comes to using keyframes. This cup is empty. I just did it for that really dumb joke. Before I show you how to do this within Final Cut Pro, I do want to explain the difference in what it's going to look like when you use keyframes versus actual camera movements. So if you have your camera on a slider, you're actually moving the camera through a scene. So if you're pushing the camera on the slider from here to here, the scene around the camera is gonna physically change, right? Like if it's moving here, it's gonna go past my computer and past all this stuff and move in the environment. If you're doing a keyframe kind of scale up or a keyframe zoom, you're just scaling up the existing image. It's very similar to zooming on your camera. But if you've used DSLR lenses, you know that zooming on them is very tough to do smoothly. They're just really not made for it. In fact, there are a few things like this little device that mounts directly onto your camera and then gives you a bit more of a lever for doing zooms, and it does help to do smoother zooms, I guess. But it's still not perfect. If you're trying to get that really subtle motion, it's very tough to do, and that's why keyframes can really help with that. So here's the first example we can go with. This is a shot of a waterfall that I filmed when I went to Iceland a while ago, and this is a static shot on a tripod. The reason I didn't do a moving shot was because I was using my travel tripod, which doesn't really have a fluid video head, and so if you try to do moving shots, they get all jittery and funky, so I just did a static shot. But this looks fine as is. I think it would look really cool if it kind of panned over a little bit. So one thing I'll have to do is scale up the image a little bit just so there's extra, like if I zoom out here and I hit transform, now you can see there's pieces of this frame that go beyond the frame itself. So that way we're not just gonna see black, we're gonna have the image covering the entire screen the entire time. And the easiest way to add keyframes is to click on your footage, press Control V, and then that's gonna bring up all your video animation. And then you can just sort of start, right now we're just gonna do an X and a Y keyframe. So I'm gonna keyframe it there, move it over here, and I'm just gonna drag the X over, and I only want it to move that far, and now I can just move the keyframes further apart. And when we play this back, we're gonna have a little bit of camera movement. And before I jump too far into this, if you don't know what keyframes are, they are literally the keyframes when it comes to animation. It's an old school animation term, but essentially in your video editing software, a keyframe, in Final Cut Pro they're marked by little diamonds, that just tells the computer that these settings need to be this way at this point in time. And so if this keyframe is right here, it's adjusting the position. And so the computer knows, Final Cut Pro knows, that these are the coordinates that this shot needs to be positioned at this point in the timeline. If I go to the other keyframe, it's the same thing. It's just telling it different coordinates for a different time. If I add in other keyframes or I do other things, it's just changing, it's just telling the computer what to do at those times. And the cool thing with Final Cut Pro is, even though I'm talking about how to add in subtle camera movements, if you go through the inspector and you go through settings and you add in some effects, anytime you see these little diamonds with a plus sign, that means add a keyframe. So as you go through the program and you start playing around with it more, you'll notice You can add keyframes for like everything, and you can add audio keyframes as well to have audio effects come in and out. If you want to put an effect on a layer, like if I added a blur to this, but I don't want it to be blurry the whole time, I can use keyframes, and basically right here I can add a keyframe at 0. Here I could add a keyframe to, you know, however much blur I want, and here I can add a keyframe back to 0, and now Final Cut is going to freeze. Oh, we'll force quit Final Cut. Reopen Final Cut. There we go. And now when I play it back, you can kind of see the blur goes in and out right here. There's no blur, there's the full amount of blur that I added, and then no blur again just because of those keyframes. I don't want to get into effect keyframing right now because that's a different video. I want to stick with camera moves, but as you're playing around, just notice you can keyframe pretty much everything that you do in Final Cut Pro, which is pretty cool. It is always important to be aware of what your camera moves mean. So in this case, basically I'm gonna have it go in the other direction from what I did originally. And the reason for that is because the water is flowing down the waterfall, and now this camera move is going with the current of the water. So it makes everything kind of flow. The other way it went against that, which sort of looked odd because the water's moving this way, but the camera's moving that way, and it just sort of seemed a bit strange. So you do want to pay attention to your camera moves, and you also want to remember what your camera movements mean. So here's another example. If you watched my review on the Aperture MC light, oh God, which this thing is just open in the background. It was this light, forgot to put those on there. It's looking like a wreck in here. Okay, if you watched my review for that light, I started with a lot of these shots that were in front of a computer display kind of showing colors and swirls and things. And basically, as you can see when I play it back, I just had the camera setting still, the display was doing movement, and the light was just sitting right there. There's no other motion taking place. But if I do the same thing, Control V, and I can just keyframe it right here, and then we can scale up a little bit. Subtlety is good. Subtlety is always good. We could add a little Y movement to kind of bring it in there. Fun tip with Final Cut Pro, when you're doing stuff like this in the player, if you click on View and Show Horizon, it will put crosshairs on it so you can line things up a little bit better, which is nice. And now, same thing as before, I can spread those out so that the movement is slower. And now we've got our camera move pushing in, which is really nice to introduce a subject. Because again, going back to thinking about what your camera moves mean, if this is the start of a video and I'm pushing into the subject, that's a good way to introduce it because we're pushing into the world, we're entering the world of that thing. If it's the end of the video, the opposite would be true, and it would make sense to pull out from that subject, so that way it feels like we're leaving and we're going away. So it's very important to pay attention to what your camera moves mean. The same thing is true for tilts. If you tilt up, it's kind of like you're going away from your subject. If you tilt down, now it's like you're introducing your subject. And one other thing that I like to do, especially for intro shots, is instead of using built-in transitions, I just use keyframes on the opacity. So I'll start here with it all the way down to 0, and then I like slow fade in, so then I'll put it all the way up to 100 and kind of see how that looks. And now we've got, I'd almost like it even slower. And now we've got this slow fade in as the camera is pushing in. There's already movement in the background. The fade and the movement of the camera were totally not there when we filmed. That was all added in during editing. One thing that's important to remember, if we go all the way to the beginning of this shot, you notice that it's pretty wide. You can even see some of the edge of the little table that I had the light on there. And that's because I knew that I would want to push in for this shot. So if you're using keyframes and you can plan ahead, it's a good idea to just film everything a little bit wider, so that way it's gonna be easier to scale up and move around within camera. Sometimes you can't do that, like my example with the slider intro. I didn't know I was gonna do those moves when I filmed. It still worked out okay though. These are sort of examples without me in it. So this is a video I made after our trip to Iceland and Switzerland a couple years ago. And the end of it is Heather and I holding hands, walking near a lake in the Swiss Alps, because that is the fanciest sounding thing I can think of. During this shot, the camera is tilting up to the sky because this is the end of our video. Of course, it was just us filming, so this was that exact same technique. We just set the camera down and then walked away in front of it, which was nice. We got to enjoy our nice like handheld walk by the lake. And then when I edited the video, I just threw in some keyframes to have the camera kind of tilt up, give that visual interest, and also since we are tilting up, we're seeing more of the landscape, we're seeing the sky, and that shows you that it's probably gonna be the end of the video. So just be sure you're always paying attention to what your camera moves mean when you're adding them in with keyframes. And you should be doing the same thing when you're filming in real life anyway. Don't just have crazy camera moves for no reason. Think about what all of this movement actually means psychologically and emotionally to your audience and to your viewer. Now, as I mentioned before, subtlety is key when you're doing this kind of thing. You don't want the moves to be super noticeable unless you're going for something crazy stylized, and you don't necessarily need to do it in every shot ever. It's just once in a while. It's a nice little trick to pull out of your tool bag, add to a video, and make it that much better. And just for the sake of clarity, I am using Final Cut Pro, which is my favorite video editing software, but if you're using anything that's slightly more advanced, pro level software, Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, any of that kind of stuff, you have the ability to use keyframes. The way that you implement your keyframes might be slightly different, but the techniques you used to make your keyframes act as a camera operator are gonna be exactly the same. But if you wanna know more about editing techniques and become a Final Cut Pro pro, put together this whole playlist right here of some Final Cut Pro tutorials that I have put together. And then we're gonna go to an end screen where you're gonna see I used keyframes to make the picture kind of move across the frame and look a little more dynamic.